Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the Philippines in a state of martial law. This as ISIS-affiliated militants last week stormed the city of Marawi, that is in the southern Mindanao Island. And with us to talk about it from Manila, columnist Richard Haydarian, the author of Asia's New Battlefield. Welcome back as well from the Philippines capital, Wilson Lee Flores, a columnist with daily newspaper The Philippine Star from London, Sharif El-Gabeli, director of the Center for Study of International Peace, and from Washington, Zachary Abuza of the National War College. We were talking before the break about the fact that being on the back foot in places like the Middle East has meant that we have seen militants flock to Southeast Asia, not just, by the way, to the Philippines. We had last week an attack in Jakarta that left 3 policemen dead. Let me ask you about this, Sharif El-Gabeli. We're seeing, again, according to authorities from the Philippines, that there are militants from places like Indonesia, like Malaysia, like Singapore that are engaged in the battle. My question to you is, can ISIS militants actually hold territory in a place like the Philippines?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, and it remains to be seen. I think that they will gain popularity with any disproportionate response by a government. And I think that that's why it's so important for Duterte to exercise that principle of proportionality in his response, and to ensure that he doesn't undermine any standards of human rights or permit any of the soldiers that are implementing the martial law to commit any violations. And we mentioned earlier, I think, that he jokingly referred to allowing soldiers to commit acts of rape. And I think that in itself is an abhorrent statement. Whether it's a joke or not, I think that it has no place being stated, even if it is a joke. That, I think, opens a door that will be very difficult to shut, because it's quite clear that even the smallest number of violations will be held to the light and will be held up as models and examples as to how the Philippines is no longer safe for the Muslim minority. It's important, I think, also to recall that the majority of Muslims in the Philippines do reside in this region, and that's around 94%. And we're talking about over 5 million people here. The isolation of these people, I think, can play into the hands of Islamist extremists, simply for the fact that they will feel persecuted. There will be certain oversteps of the mark or of the line, and if the Philippine government is not careful in ensuring that they act in a proportionate manner and in a way that is compliant with what human rights cannot be derogated from, then there will be, of course, some quite severe repercussions.
Yeah, the Philippines president, as you were saying, employing his trademark Duterte Harry swagger in an off-the-cuff remark that shocked many. Let's take a listen.
If you go down, I go down. But for this martial law and the consequences of martial law and the ramifications of martial law, I and I alone would be responsible. Trabaho lang kayo. Ako na ang magpakulong sa inyo. Pag naka-rape ka ng 3, aminin ko na akin yun.
Richard Haydarian, what are the consequences of a remark like that one?
Well, this is exactly the first time whereby Duterte has made, some sort of off-the-cuff statement. I mean, there's no excuse for what he said. I mean, this is a very sensitive, issue. I mean, we're talking about Muslim community whereby, any sexual harassment of women is extremely big issue because it means you're dishonoring the entire clan and family. So I think for someone like Duterte, who claims to have Moro background, who is from Mindanao, that was definitely uncalled for. But I think he was taken by the gravity of the moment. I think he really wanted to show that he's there with the military through and through. And if you look at it, the off-the-cuff statements came towards the end when he was kind of changing his tone and trying to just drop some jokes. And I think maybe a combination of exhaustion and lack of, proper care with his language explains that. But definitely there's no excuse for that kind of language. Now, the other thing we have to keep in mind is, by the way, not the entire Philippines is under martial law.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Richard, is this 60 days of martial law for the south of the country justified?
Well, my point is that the government is yet to provide a very specific report. Per the Philippine Constitution, the president has to do that. He has to forward a specific report justifying why there is, because the only way for you to declare martial law is if there is a state of rebellion or a state of invasion. Now, the government is saying is that both things are happening. You have invasion because you have foreign fighters. What I'm hearing on the ground is that there are also possibly Arab fighters, not only Indonesian or Malaysian, which is worrying a lot of people. So you see tremendous internationalization of the dispute. They're also saying this is a rebellion. Nonetheless, of course, just 4 years ago in 2013, there was also a massive siege on the city of Zamboanga, led by some splinter faction of MNLF, and the government did not declare martial law in Mindanao. The same way with President Estrada, with President Ramos in the 90s and early 2000s, similar situation happened, but they did not declare martial law. Perhaps the reason they declared martial law this time was that they realized that perhaps the president and the government needs more legal leeway to deal with the problem of ISIS. I mean, the Philippines is not yet on the level of Boko Haram or Nigeria, whereby you have a potent ISIS affiliate groups actually controlling territory and huge population. But I think the martial law was a preemptive measure in order to prevent that. But I think the moment Duterte tries to extend the martial law beyond Mindanao to Visayas and the Manila region, I think that's where he's going to get the resistance, including from within his own alliance, his own supermajority in the Congress, and from the military.
Wilson Lee Flores, let me ask you, this declaration of martial law, we even heard Duterte hint that perhaps it could be extended to the rest of the country. Is that justified?
I doubt it would extend beyond Mindanao because the main problem is in parts of Mindanao only, not even in the entire Mindanao region. And I think earlier, I'd like to mention earlier, Richard said that the problem is not only the President Duterte also. I think the good thing about martial law is he could, after this martial law thing, he could go negotiate with the rebels from a position of strength. I think because the government, I think he is sincere in his efforts to negotiate with the communists and the Muslim rebels, but showing this strong response to rebellion and terrorism will strengthen his hand. And I think about the concern about the military, as long as the president supports them strongly and you have a decisive president with a clear policy and strategic objectives, I think the support of the military will be very strong. And I heard among the rank and file, many of the military people like him. And I think his popularity is stronger than even past Philippine presidents before. So I really doubt martial law will go all the way to Manila. I think it will be confined to Mindanao and not for a very long period of time.
Zachary Abuza, of course, the declaration of martial law for people, that conjures memories of 1972 when the Philippine strongman at the time, Ferdinand Marcos, decreed it. It lasted for more than a decade, and it was the pretext for a bloody crackdown. Is it unfair to compare Duterte to Marcos?
Not at all. He emulates Marcos. He spoke as much when he was a candidate for presidency. He was very quick to inter the remains of the former president in the Heroes Cemetery despite public opposition. He's been warning for 2 years now that he would look to declaring martial law to solve the country's problems. I should note that the situation in Mindanao got much worse under Marcos when he declared martial law, and I do not think that there's any justification to declare martial law right now, and I think it's going to be quite counterproductive. You are going to see
But you just heard
abuses.
Wilson Lee Flores saying that he's got the backing of the army and he's more popular than ever.
Wait until you start to see the abuses of human rights. You've already had 8,000 people gunned down through extrajudicial killings by security forces in his war on drugs. There are going to be excesses in this campaign. The Philippine military has no experience in urban street-to-street combat. This could go south very quickly. They've engaged in shelling from the air and artillery shelling from a distance into urban areas. This is not helpful. This is not going to help the security situation in the long run. And might I remind you that the Philippine military still remains very dependent on U.S. military assistance and sales. With the declaration of martial law, there are now going to be congressional restrictions. We've already seen holds on some sales of military weapons to the police because of their involvement in these extrajudicial killings in the war on drugs. This is going to be very counterproductive to the Philippine military's long-term interests.
Sherry Felgabelli, it sounds like a familiar story. It's very difficult for countries to get a grip on counterinsurgency.
Yes, that's right. I think it's immensely difficult once Islamist extremism has taken a hold, particularly in areas, as I mentioned before, where there's poverty. This is something that we've seen across the board, really, in a variety of Middle Eastern states, and we're seeing it now in a few of the Asian states as well, Southeast Asia. Certainly, the draw or the attraction of Islamist extremism is far more alluring to those who have nothing else to live for. And there are a wealth of reasons why people join extremist groups like Daesh or their affiliates. But certainly, I think research has shown us quite clearly that there are certain environments in which that type of extremism is very willingly accepted. We've seen it in Tunisia, we've seen it in Syria, in Iraq, and now in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and certainly in the Philippines in the south. Just touching on the previous point that was made, I think that I would agree wholeheartedly with it. I would add also that the south of the Philippines is heavily reliant on agriculture, and that shelling and military intervention in the south of the Philippines is very likely to actually decimate large areas of that, which is just going to spiral the area into further chaos and further poverty, because people will not be able to make ends meet. And as I've said, that will then have a seriously negative impact on security and on peace in the area.
Richard Idarian, another point that was brought up there by Zachary Abuza, the Philippines military relying heavily on the U.S. military. What's going to be the relationship going forward between Washington and Manila?
Well, I think Wilson was right that Duterte has some popularity among the rank and file, but I mean, the reality is that there are two reasons why I don't think the military will welcome a martial law across the country beyond Mindanao, or even an extended martial law in Mindanao. One is ideological. Since the fall of the Marcos dictatorship, you have a lot of new doctrines coming into the military. I think there has been an ideological embrace the basic democratic principles of the Philippine Constitution. And remember, the military's task is to defend the Philippine Constitution, not necessarily just follow blindly the president. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind. But there are, I think Zachary put it very correctly, there are also material consideration. 75% of the total weaponries of the armed forces of the Philippines comes from only one country, and that is the United States. A lot of the leading officials, including former President Ramos, who is also advisor of Duterte, are graduates of American universities like the West Point. So training is there, money comes from America, and in terms of high-grade intelligence, the United States is the leading country in the world that can provide that to Duterte. Duterte cannot count on countries like China and Russia, which are struggling to deal with the problems in Xinjiang and Chechnya themselves. So I think this is where Duterte will be increasingly pushed to patch up differences with the Trump administration, which, by the way, has been very supportive towards Duterte. President Trump has been almost sympathetic to Duterte's war on drugs. He has been mum on human rights issues. And just after the declaration of martial law in Mindanao, he said that America is a quote-unquote proud ally of the Philippines and will provide all necessary counterterrorism assistance. And in the coming months, it's almost certain that Duterte and Trump are going to meet each other. It's not clear whether twice or once. What I knew initially was that there was a plan to visit the White House by Duterte earlier than November, probably September, October. But that plan is now under question. But clearly in November, during the East Asia Summit, Trump confirmed his visit to Manila, and that's where they're going to have a bilateral summit. So I think the gravity of the problem in Mindanao and the gravity of the counterterrorism concern is going to push Duterte to patch up differences with the United States. And then, of course, the necessity for investing in peace process and development in Mindanao will force him to reconsider his earlier rejection of European Union grants. Up to $300 million of European Union grants are also now hanging in the balance because of Duterte's disagreement with Western countries over human rights issues. He now has to revisit all of those.
And when Zachary Abuza says that Duterte emulates Ferdinand Marcos, how far does that go? The opposition saying that he's got the makings, the trappings of somebody who could be a dictator.
Well, I mean, the specter of a Marcosian authoritarianism is perhaps there. I mean, you cannot deny that. And the president's incendiary rhetoric sometimes doesn't really help in terms of, calming down anxieties. But the fact of the matter is that the conditions are very different. Perhaps I'm being over-optimistic, but the reality is that this is a different military we're talking about compared to the 1970s. This is a military that is recovering from the horrors of martial law, which also undermines its own credibility. The second thing is, by the way, it took Marcos years before he could bribe the entire military to go with him. And it took a lot of investment in the military and increasing defense spending for him to get that. As far as Duterte is concerned, his popularity among the rank and file is because of his sincerity and his character. And I think that's the reason why. It's not because he has really increased their basic benefits and bonuses and salary. He promised to do so, but that hasn't happened. So I think there are many factors for us to say that the probability for a nationwide martial law or resuscitation of a Marcosian dictatorship is very, very low. But as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes.
Wilson Lee Flores, do you agree?
So I missed some parts of it, but I think he's correct that martial law wouldn't be the same because Marcos' era, that was the time when the whole of Asia was authoritarian. Everywhere from South Korea, Park Chung-hee, to Malaysia, Thailand, everyone in Asia, almost everyone was under authoritarian rule. Now it's no longer the same conditions, and the Philippines has already gone through that era. It's like a genie that has already gone out, the democracy. I don't think we can go back to that situation again. It's very far-fetched, and it's like, I think it will be totally different. But I see Duterte as a strong leader within a very strongly democratic society. Even with martial law in Mindanao, the courts there are all functioning. The free press in Mindanao area and in the Philippines is very vibrant, very critical. Our media very alive. So I don't see martial law, Marcos style, coming back under Duterte.
Don't see it coming back under Duterte. Zachary Abuza, because we're almost out of time, are you reassured?
No, I'm not. I don't think this is going to help at all. The Philippines has a host of security challenges, and it just takes leadership, and the president has not been focused on the security situation in Mindanao. He has been focused on these extrajudicial killings and his war on drugs. It's time for him to really take the lead and push through the peace process with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and slowly take apart these black flag groups. But it's not going to be done through the suspension of the rule of law.
All right, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, Zachary Abuza, for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Sharif El Gabeli in London, Richard Haidarian and Wilson Lee Flores in Manila. Stay with us because our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, François.
Differing points of view there on whether or not Rodrigo Duterte is another Ferdinand Marcos in the making in the Philippines. Of course, a lot of reactions to what's been going on the last 8 days.
That's right. It is generating comments on social media, as you would expect. And just to, obviously, there's a whole range of different comments. I've just been looking in English. And here's a look at some of those various remarks on social media. Some, over the last week or so, linking the terrible attack in Manchester with what's happening in Marawi, and indeed with ISIS claiming responsibility, or at least being involved in some way, shape or form in both of those terrible incidents, which are very different incidents in very different parts of the world. People are linking that on social media. Pray for Manchester, pray for Marawi, with a message in this particular tweet saying that ISIS do not follow Islam. Islam is a religion of peace. So that's one sort of theme. I've seen a lot of tweets mentioning Manchester and Marawi together.
Interesting.
Elsewhere, we're seeing various Twitter accounts relaying photos of what has been happening over the last week. Here you have one image showing ongoing fighting in downtown areas of Marawi between Islamic terrorists and security forces. I'll show you some of these images and then I'll give you, I suppose, a comment on them. Army Marines have seized a number of weapons and ammo from IS-linked #Maute group. You can see images there purporting to be from the Islamic State organization. Islamic State group. Here again on the same Twitter account, which is called @TerrorEvents. It has over 18,000 followers and relays information about terror attacks around the world. Not a very, I suppose, joyous Twitter account, but that's its stated purpose. And here in this tweet, Islamic State-linked militants are forcing local Christians to convert to Islam. That is a report that we heard elsewhere as well, of course. And Islamic State supporters spreading pictures of the situation in the city, large numbers of buildings set on fire. Now, what I would say about these images is this claims these photos are supposedly taken by Islamic State supporters who are then uploading them online as pro-Islamic State propaganda. We only have the word of this particular Twitter account to go on for that. It's not a news agency. We can't be certain of the source of these photos or whether or not they indeed originate in Marawi. So there is a big potential for disinformation and misinformation on a story like this. And just to give you a concrete example of how that can play out, there were images relayed by the Philippines news agency showing images that supposedly were taking place in Marawi with the army intervening. The Filipino news agency was forced to retract that image because, in fact, it came from an incident that happened in Vietnam. So here you have a sort of a mea culpa, an admission of error by the PNA, saying that the Vietnam photo was used in the Marawi story. But perhaps they would not have made that mea culpa unless they were called on it. It looks like they were just using any old photo to illustrate the story. So that is an example of the extent to which stories like this coming out of Marawi, where there isn't a huge news infrastructure or presence, are liable to be somewhat misrepresented on social media, certainly in terms of images.
It's fascinating because there's two things you're saying there. On the one hand, once again, people in a rush to get stuff out before verifying it.
Right.
And also there's the war on the ground and the war that's taking place on social media.
That's right. So new social media, as ever, it is not the most reliable source of news. It's a very rich source of news, but it needs to be verified. And we have some examples here of where either there's a question mark hanging over the authenticity of photos, or some photos have in fact been proven not to be authentic. There's also a lot of all-out conspiracy theories regarding this story on social media. I won't necessarily relay that.
No,
but there's a lot. If you type Philippines into social media, you're having conspiracy theories about Duterte having kicked out the head of the central bank, and that this is some shadowy conspiracy by the West to put Islamic State in response. So that's, I suppose, the nth degree of disinformation that you're also finding on social media. So to be taken with, what would you say, caution when you go on social media in terms of searching for information about these stories.
And thankfully, there's a vibrant press that is alive and well in the Philippines, which we can rely on, which we have been relying on for a lot of our information. James Creedon, many thanks for that. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.